Good morning. So I'm Ray Van Aragon. I'm Dean of the Faculty. I want to welcome you to Primetime in the Library. Primetime is a Bethel Library program that is a collaboration between the Friends of the Bethel Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. So thank you for joining us. Today is our last Primetime of the season. Thank you all that have presented and participated in the last few months. Watch the e-announcements in February for coming presentations. Today we celebrate Dr. Sherryse Corrow, Professor of Psychology, who is the Faculty Excellence Award for Scholarship winner for this year. Faculty Excellence Awards are awarded every year in the areas of teaching, scholarship, and service. Faculty members nominate their colleagues, and the Professional Development and Retreat Planning Committee selects the winners. The Faculty Excellence in Scholarships nominations includes information about the candidates' list of contributions to the discipline, their scholarly contribution to their department, and how their scholarship benefits the Bethel community as well as the broader academy and beyond. It's easy to see how Dr. Corrow is, how qualified she is to win the Faculty Excellence in Scholarship Award. As those in her department who nominated her wrote, she has over 30 peer-reviewed publications and always has multiple manuscripts under review. Moreover, and here I'm quoting directly from what they wrote, Sherryse's scholarly productivity is all the more impressive given her devotion to her teaching and excellent service to the psychology department and the institution as a whole. Additionally, she includes many students in her research lab every semester, working with them on their own individual projects or including them in her work that she continues to do with her postdoctoral institute, the University of British Columbia. Today, Dr. Corrow will be sharing about her 10 years of research on face blindness and how she has engaged students in the research process. Join me in welcoming and congratulating her.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I was a bit ambitious with my title. As it turns out, covering a decade of research in 1 hour is kind of challenging. So I'm going to give you a little taste of some of the things that we've done, and I'm going to try to save the rest for the water cooler. So, yeah. So in my first year of graduate school, a little more than a decade ago, we were contacted by the parents of a 6-year-old boy, and his parents told us that they thought their son couldn't recognize people's faces. They said that he couldn't recognize his classmates, his friends, family members, even sometimes them, his brother. They told me that he had 2 friends in class. One was a child who wore a cast all the time, or at least for a long period of time, and the other one was a little girl who dressed in pink from head to toe every day, therefore making them fairly reliably easy to identify. So attending school each day for this young man was very anxiety-provoking for him. He felt he was constantly surrounded by strangers, such that eventually they would occasionally find him even shut in his locker because he was so anxious about the situation. His teachers believed that he had autism. Spoiler alert, he did not. And in the end, his parents decided to pull him from the public education system for homeschooling. So this was, after hearing their story, we asked them to bring him to the lab, and we also asked them to give us a series of photographs of family members, friends, so on and so forth. And we edited them so that they looked something like this, so that only the face was visible. This is my daughter, Eleanor. We showed him pictures one by one, and in the end, he recognized only one person, his uncle, who I remember having a mustache, kind of like Ben Stiller in Dodgeball. So again, something that was very, very easy to remember. So we showed him pictures one by one, and in the end, he recognized just that one person. Again, easy to pick out among a crowd. So in our little test, he didn't recognize his mom, his dad, his brother. He didn't recognize a picture of himself. He didn't recognize a photograph of me sitting right next to him. So anyways, clearly having troubles with his face recognition ability. Furthermore, his younger brother was able to recognize all of these people. So really going to show that it wasn't lack of experience with these people, because he and his brother shared experiences with these individuals. So this was my first case of studying face blindness and the beginning of my journey to try to understand the brain by studying face recognition. But I'd like to back up for a moment and ask you to think about how formidable of a feat it is that we can recognize faces at all. Okay? In some sense, faces all kind of look the same, right? Two eyes above a nose and a mouth. Yet we can recognize thousands of people without really much effort. So think about how many people you can recognize, like guesstimate, add it up in your head a little bit. Family members, friends, professors, classmates, coworkers. As you're adding in the head, this is a lot of people, and there's probably a lot of people that you're leaving out. Don't forget about the people from the past that you don't currently have contact with, that you would still recognize if you saw them today, even after an extended period of time. Think also about celebrities. You might not even included those people. Politicians, right? We're actually really good at being able to recognize celebrity faces even though we haven't met them in person. I'll show you. Let's give it a shot. I'm going to show you a series of faces, and I would actually like you to shout out the name of the people as they come up on the screen. The challenge here is that I'm going to give you only 1 second for each face. Not much time. Are you ready?
Ready.
Here we go.
Oprah. Trump. Gaga. Corrow.
Okay, so clearly you guys can do this well. You can do it really quickly. The fact that you're able to shout out the name even before the face disappears tells me that you can process these faces in milliseconds, right? So you guys can do this really quickly. Okay, so when you consider the vast number of faces that the average person can recognize, it becomes clear pretty quickly that face recognition is a very highly specialized skill. In fact, there's no other object type that humans can process as expertly as we can faces. So in this sense, faces are pretty unique. It seems, therefore, that our brain treats faces as being special, different than other kinds of objects. And we actually have quite a bit of evidence for this. I'm going to show you a few examples. First, researchers have discovered that our ability to recognize faces is better when faces are upright than when faces are upside down. And that's kind of a hint at the fact that our brain is doing something particular with an upright face that makes it different than an inverted face or any other kind of object for that matter. So I'm going to show you this again, and this time I don't want you to shout out the answer. I just want you to get the feel for how different it feels to recognize an upside down face versus an inverted one. Ready? Taylor Swift. So again, we're trying to say, is it easy? Did you get it the second time but not the first, right? There's another one. Brad Pitt. Kim Kardashian, right? Yes? Okay, good. This one's harder maybe for some of you younger folks. Alicia Silverstone, remember Clueless? Yes. Okay. Lost my spots. All right, so you probably noticed that this was a little bit harder than the first task. Again, why? Because this is showing us that our brain processes upright faces a little bit differently than upside down faces, suggesting that it's kind of we're treating faces as a special class of object. Here's another example. I have up here for you a mask. The inside of the mask is painted by our one and only Amanda Hamilton, so please give her credit where credit is due. I'd like you to notice what happened when I point the painted side of the mask at you. Those of you who are closer might need to cover up an eye for this to work properly. But what you might notice when you kind of fixate Einstein's face is as I move him from side to side, not only does he pop out at you, but he seems to follow you around a little bit. Okay, so I'll give you a chance to just kind of look at that. Okay, So this illusion is actually even more effective in a video, which you can see the same, so this will help those of you that are a little bit further away. The reason why it's more effective in a video is because depth information is more ambiguous on a two-dimensional surface like this than it is in person. Now again, there's many reasons why this works, but one of those factors is that our brain is expecting faces to be upright and it expects faces to stick out because we don't have much experience with faces that are inverted, right? Generally speaking, noses stick out at us, okay? So despite what we know to be true, that this is a concave mask, our brain goes, nope, faces go the other way around. So it expects faces to have a particular shape. Here's another example. These are two photographs of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. You might have the general sense that the photos look slightly different from one another. When the faces are upside down, the difference between them isn't nearly as apparent as when I flip the faces right side up. Yeah, I hear, ooh. Now you can see that her eyes and her mouth have been inverted relative to the rest of her face, and the effect is actually kind of grotesque. But we don't notice that grotesqueness when the faces are inverted, but we do notice it when we're upright. So once again, evidence that upright faces are special for us. Finally, perhaps the most striking piece of evidence that we have that our brain is treating faces as a special class of object is that we have areas of the brain that are devoted to face processing. So on the left, you see this is my brain on the left in 3 different orientations. And on the right, you can see where my brain showed activity when I was viewing faces in particular. Okay? And so we know that we have kind of face areas of the brain that will reliably light up across people. They tend to be very consistent in the same location. This is something that's fairly easy to demonstrate at this point using MRI technology. And the fact that these areas exist in and of itself is indication that the brain is treating faces as a special class of object. Furthermore, if you interrupt the activity in this area, so in particular, I'm going to be talking about the fusiform face area, that's this one right here. If you interrupt the activity in this area, you get rather interesting effects on face perception. So this is a video of a gentleman who's undergoing surgery to treat medication-resistant epileptic seizures. And he has electrodes placed on the surface of his scalp, and they're using that opportunity to investigate what happens when you kind of mess with the activity in that face area. Okay? So watch what happens.
Look at my face. 1, 2, 3.
You just turned into somebody else.
Tell me
Your
about
face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy, went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. That was a trip.
So these kinds of investigations truly emphasize that the brain is treating faces as a special kind of object. But perhaps the biggest evidence that we have that faces are special to the brain is that some people are simply unable to recognize faces despite being able to do all other visual things, right? They can recognize objects, they can see just fine, they can even process the emotion of the face, things like that. So this is a disorder called prosopagnosia. Sometimes we call it face blindness because prosopagnosia is a mouthful. Someone with prosopagnosia, as I said, can see just fine. Their memory is not impaired. If you ask them what does a face look like, they will describe it to you. It's not that they can't see the face, but they can't remember it later. Or they're not processing something about the face that allows them to remember it later. Sometimes it can be rather mild enough that people can go well into adulthood without even realizing that this is a deficit for them, or also because they might not realize that other people are recognizing people by their faces. It's not something that we talk about. I don't run into Kathy in the hallway and say, "Hi, Kathy, it's so nice to see you. I recognized you by your face," right? That's not the way that we talk. But it can be rather mild. My husband, for instance, has a mild case of prosopagnosia. Some years ago, we were watching Orange is the New Black, and he saw a scene with Yoga Jones, if you're familiar with the show. And upon seeing Yoga Jones, he said, "I didn't know Ellen DeGeneres was in this show."
Oh, yeah.
And I said, that's not Ellen DeGeneres, but I didn't think much of it until a little bit later when he saw a scene with Lolly Whitehill and said, you can't tell me that that's not Ellen DeGeneres. Of which I responded, that's not Ellen DeGeneres, but it's also not Yoga Jones. Like, this is a completely different character. So clearly he was having a hard time following the plot of the television show because he was having a hard time keeping track of who was whom. And this is actually a really common characteristic, a common complaint of people with prosopagnosia. They tend to gravitate towards things like Star Trek and South Park, where the characters are really easy to keep track of. But other times it can be quite severe. For example, I remember a participant telling me that they caught themselves waving at their reflection in a wall-length mirror of a department store because they kind of looked at, people will do this, they look up and they're like, that person's looking at me like they know me. I should probably wave. And it wasn't until they started waving that they were like, oh, this is a mirror, right? And in cases of severe prosopagnosia, people will say, yeah, even under the best circumstances, I'm not going to, if I run into my mom or my spouse in an unexpected place, I'm not going to know who they are. Importantly, prosopagnosia comes in two forms. The first is acquired prosopagnosia. So this is the result of a brain injury. So here on the left, you see the brain of an individual who could recognize faces until this particular person had a case of herpes encephalitis that left widespread damage primarily to the right temporal lobe. Now, my directions are actually okay. I realize you're probably thinking that's the left, but in conventional MRI imaging, it's flipped, right? So this is actually the right side of his brain, even though it appears on the left side. And so you can see that lesion, at least on this slice, outlined in red. After this occurred, he could no longer recognize faces. This particular lesion is large enough that it wiped out several of those face areas that we talked about, leaving him with a very severe case of prosopagnosia. The second is what we call developmental prosopagnosia, sometimes called congenital prosopagnosia. And in these cases, there's no visible lesion on an MRI scan. In these cases, the ability to recognize faces simply never developed. And we expect this to affect up to 2% of the population. So it's actually very common. I run into people at Bethel all the time who tell me, by the way, I don't recognize faces. And so it's very, very common in the population. So in recent years, we've discovered a lot about acquired prosopagnosia. This is research that's been going on a long time, especially with after like a war period where there's people with gunshot wounds and things like that that have created damage to the brain and then have since lost their face recognition ability. This kind of stuff has been going on for a long time. Our understanding of developmental prosopagnosia is a bit trickier, both because we don't have like a lesion to study. You look at their brains, they look fine. But also because it's a newer realm of research. Research on developmental prosopagnosia hasn't been going on very long. So for about the last decade, I, along with my collaborators, have been working hard to try to understand developmental prosopagnosia in particular. So what I'm going to share with you now is a quick summary of some of the kinds of things that we've been doing in the last 10 years to better understand developmental prosopagnosia, which is sometimes in my slide just labeled as DP. As you'll see, a lot of this work has been informed by what we've done with acquired prosopagnosia. So we kind of take these acquired cases and we figure out what they can do and what they can't do and relate that to their lesions. And then if we can find people with developmental prosopagnosia who kind of have similar behavioral outcomes is someone with a particular lesion type, we can use that to inform what might be going on in the brain. Okay. For example, when someone acquires prosopagnosia, the brain lesions are often big and messy. It turns out when you have a stroke, it doesn't like contain itself to one particular region of the brain, right? And so as a result, people who have acquired prosopagnosia often have deficits in other things as well, okay? But that information is useful for us because it helps us to figure out like what things are surrounding these face areas and what's being affected in those lesions. So as a result of these studies, we found that those with acquired prosopagnosia are often, but not always, affected in their object recognition, although to a much lesser extent. If somebody with acquired prosopagnosia couldn't identify a couch as a couch or a refrigerator as a refrigerator, we would call that object agnosia. That's a different thing. But sometimes more subtle deficits in object recognition, difficulty navigating, like they'll say in extreme cases, I can't find my way around my own house. And in less extreme cases, I could not possibly navigate without a phone telling me where to go or something like that. Deficits in color vision, all the way from more subtle deficits in color vision to achromataxia, where they're seeing the world in shades of gray. Deficits in voice recognition, so being able to identify somebody by listening just to their voice. And then, as we've recently found out, pitch processing and more. All due as a result of damage to kind of areas nearby, or perhaps because the neural resources are shared between face recognition and some of these other things. So one question that we've investigated is whether or not the deficit in developmental prosopagnosia is specific to faces, or are some of these other things affected too? And that might give us clues about what's going on in prosopagnosia. What are those neural resources? What are they contributing to? Or what are those face areas connected to? And how does this develop? Okay. So, for example, people with acquired prosopagnosia often report that after a brain injury, they're unable to navigate. Sometimes people with developmental prosopagnosia will tell us this as well, but it's less common. So we set out to investigate this. We gave people a task where they had to identify landmarks. We also, not shown here, they had to identify famous landmarks that we asked them to learn. We also asked them to learn and remember particular scenes. And we gave them a mental map formation task where they have to explore a virtual environment and then create a mental map of that space, much in the way that we do when we learn a new space. Okay? So what we found is, as expected, when we're working with people with acquired prosopagnosia, almost all of them have difficulty learning and remembering landmarks and scenes. Okay? The face areas, is particularly those posterior face areas, are like right up next to those navigational areas near the hippocampus. And about half of them are unable to form a mental map. So they just couldn't do this task to kind of create an image of like where buildings were in a space. In developmental prosopagnosia, however, none of them had a difficulty with this task. And only one of them struggled to form this mental map. Okay? So in this case, you're like, maybe people with developmental prosopagnosia aren't on the regular experiencing difficulty with navigation, at least as we tested it here. We also asked whether those with prosopagnosia have deficits in reading. Now you might be like, why reading? So as it turns out in the brain, so I already mentioned that fusiform face area, right? That's the area that they stimulated when the guy said that the face was like melting before his eyes. And that's in the right hemisphere. If you look at that exact same spot in the left hemisphere, we call that the visual word form area. It's an area that's essential for reading. If you damage that area, you have alexia and you're no longer able to read. But there's some interesting research on the development of how these areas arise, where essentially beginning early in life, there's a theory that these both kind of start out as face object processing areas. And reading, which is kind of a newer skill in the timeline of life, reading is something where once we start reading, that left area gets taken over. It's like, this is going to become the reading area now. Okay? So we know that particularly people with acquired prosopagnosia, if they have a bilateral lesion, which they often do when they have a stroke, that affects both the FFA and this visual word form area, then they have deficits in reading. So we wanted to ask, okay, well, if the people with prosopagnosia, developmental prosopagnosia, are struggling with faces, maybe they also have subtle deficits in reading too, to that same region, but on the other side of the brain. So we gave them a reading task with an eye tracker that basically allows us to measure how long it takes them to read a single word. And we also gave them tasks where they were asked to sort words by their style. So rather than sorting the words by the word, we would say, I want you to put all of the Calibri font right here, and put all this type of handwriting right here. And they're making piles of these things, okay? So it allows us to get at some of the different types of things that are going on in this word processing, okay? So what we found is, again, in acquired prosopagnosia, those that had bilateral lesions, as expected, had deficits in reading single words, okay? That's not surprising. Pretty much all of the people with acquired prosopagnosia struggled to sort words by their style, okay? Which then makes us go, like what's going on in the face areas of the brain that's contributing to that piece of reading, right? The stylistic aspect of handwriting, font, that sort of thing. So it kind of gives us clues as to what's going on in these areas. In developmental prosopagnosia, again, we didn't have anybody who was impaired in reading, which suggests that their visual word form area is functioning. And we only had one that showed a deficit in being able to sort by handwriting or font. Okay, so we actually have other studies like this. I'm not going to go through all of them, showing fairly normal visual processing for things, right? So we already covered navigation, we covered reading. We also show fairly normal in most subjects ability to process color, right? So doing color sorting tasks and things like that, and fairly normal voice recognition in our subjects with developmental prosopagnosia. So we were sort of just about to come to the conclusion that, like, yep, this is really specific to faces, right? The people with prosopagnosia have a deficit that's really affecting their face areas and nothing else. And then we decided to kind of dive into a long-standing question. There's a long debate in the field about whether or not there's impairments in object recognition in developmental prosopagnosia. Like maybe the face area isn't really a face area. Maybe it's like an expertise area or something like that, okay? So we decided to delve into this. We asked participants to complete a series of object recognition tasks. But in one of them, we asked them first, it was a non-visual task. So we wanted to start by getting a baseline for people. What do you know about cars? Because it's really hard to test car recognition when some people are experts and some people aren't. So we had to start with what do you know about cars? And so we gave them a task where we would provide focus and then they had to provide forward. Thank you. And if we would provide accord, they had to provide yes, great. So this allows us to get a sense of what kind of semantic knowledge do they have about cars. And then we could compare that to how they're doing on an actual car recognition task, because we would expect that somebody who does really, really well at this would also do really well at this. Tell us what's the make, the model, the decade of this particular kind of car. So what we find here is first we plot just the control subjects. As you might expect, if you're really good at semantic knowledge of cars, you're really good at recognizing cars as well, okay? So that's why this line goes like this. So this here is the semantic knowledge, and this is their ability to recognize different cars. What I want to point out is that both the developmental and the acquired prosopagnosics really struggled with this. So they didn't have like really drastic impairments in object recognition, but once you take into account their baseline knowledge of what they already knew going into the task, then we did see deficits. So there does seem to be some things going on here. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they have more than one deficit in the brain. As I said, it could be that that fusiform face area is contributing something to object recognition too. So it doesn't necessarily take us outside of these face areas. However, then we went one step further. We had a few participants kind of spontaneously say to us that they were tone deaf. And I'll admit, at first I was kind of like, okay, cool, thanks for the note. But it happened a few times that eventually I was like, I feel responsible as a researcher that I had enough people say this to me that I need to look into it, even though I feel like there's unlikely to be anything here. So we gave them a series of pitch tasks. I'm going to show you just one here. The task is there's 2 melodies back to back with a short pause in between, and you have to decide if they're the same or different. The pause. Okay. Different. Those ones were different. Some of you are like, oh, I don't know. Yep. Okay. Those ones were different. Okay, so that's what one of the tasks sounded like that's in many ways the most relevant to our results. But generally speaking, what we found is when we did this with people with acquired prosopagnosia, what we found is that a third of them really struggled with their pitch processing, but not rhythm. So we gave them rhythm tasks too, and their deficits seemed to be specific to processing pitch. Okay? We did the same thing with adults with developmental prosopagnosia, and this time a quarter of the participants showed deficits in pitch processing, but not rhythm. Now, tone deafness is something that's fairly common in the population, but it's estimated to affect probably no more than about 4% of people. So finding a prevalence of about 25% is actually fairly striking. Okay? So we kind of were like, okay, we don't conclude much from one study. Maybe we just had like a weird population or something like that, and it was just fluke chance. But then actually since then, this study has been replicated. So we're kind of over time more and more confident. Furthermore, we did have some collaborators that we worked on a study with where they had a group of people who were recruited because they were tone deaf, tested their face recognition, and they really struggled with faces. Yeah. Okay. So what does this all mean? Is the impairment in developmental prosopagnosia specific to faces? My answer to that is like, not really. Because originally we were kind of like faces, it's faces, it's faces, it's faces, it's faces. And then we went, okay, objects, but we kind of might have expected that. And then all of a sudden this pitch stuff landed in our lap and we were like, huh, weird. So there are some theories out there that get at the idea of like similar kinds of things, but in the other half of the brain. So if we cross over the great divide of the corpus callosum and we start talking to the people who look into things like dyslexia, there's questions about cortical migration disorders, like in early development, all these neurons are migrating to where they need to go. And maybe there's a deficit in that. And for some reason, that pathway is similarly affected for pitch and faces. And there could be, and that also, the nice thing about that theory is that it also could explain why we've got some people who are impaired in navigation with faces, or they are impaired in reading with processing stylistic aspects of text, because there could be variability among people and how this like cortical migration stuff plays out. Okay. Another important question that we ask is not like what else is affected, but in people with prosopagnosia, like what about faces are they not processing? Like what's going on there? Okay, so again, we're using cases of acquired prosopagnosia to guide our search for the most part. So an important first question is, are people with developmental prosopagnosia, are they just using like a not great strategy? Like are they, when they're meeting somebody, are they like looking at their mouth to identify them? And I think intuitively, most people in this group here will probably go like, yeah, that's not what I do. Even though it's not something we think about, we just kind of know that when we try to recognize someone, we don't look at their mouth. So we did an eye tracking study. So it's kind of like this. They see faces, and the yellow areas just indicate kind of where we're looking. So we're recording the amount of time and how frequently they visit different areas of the face. And we didn't do it just this way, so I'm going to show you the data for eyes versus mouth, but we also did like center versus periphery. We did eyes versus mouth, like more directly, things like that. So we broke it down in many ways. And interesting, like what we find, so on this graph here, each dot represents a participant. And if your dot is this direction, you're more inclined to look at the eyes. And if your dot is this correct direction, you're more inclined to look at the mouth, relatively speaking. And then the results are color-coded. So the blue dots are the controls, the green and the orange are the acquired prosopagnosia participants, and then the red are our developmental group. And as you can see, hopefully, most of the people are like chilling out there with the control subjects. Like their strategy for looking at faces is very similar to most people. Not that surprising for acquired prosopagnosia because you wouldn't necessarily expect someone after a lesion to suddenly start looking at faces differently. But we weren't quite sure what to expect with the developmental group. But it turns out most people, we had one developmental subject who did look at the mouth more than the eyes, and one acquired subject as well that did the same. But when we looked at other things like center versus periphery, everybody was just like the controls, right? So the strategy doesn't really seem to be that different than what we expect for compared to controls. Another thing that we think about when we're asking, like, how are they processing faces? Okay, so I'm going back to acquired prosopagnosia as an example. So here you see the brains of 5 different people. And importantly, all of these people, if you give them 2 faces side by side and ask them, are they the same or different? They're like, I don't know. Like they struggle with even just that task. So it's not just a memory thing. We say that this is a deficit in face perception, right? It's like before the memory part, okay? And as I've pointed out for you here, they all have lesions in right about the same place. Okay? So their brain lesions are what we right kind of where it really the FFA that I've already talked about, but it's where our temporal lobe meets our occipital lobe, like right at that junction there. On the other hand, these 4 individuals, if you give them that task, are these 2 faces the same or different? They can do that without a problem, but they just can't remember the face later. So I can give them that task, they can compare these faces, but then if I show them those faces again later, they're like, I have no idea who those people are. Okay? And so notably, all of these people have, again, lesions in the same location. They're all in what we would call the anterior temporal face area, so to the closest, but you can think of it as like kind of just behind their right eye, they have lesions. So, and these folks all have deficits in face memory. So an important question then for us is, what about developmental prosopagnosia? Do they show the same kind of distinction? And if they do, what's going to lead, is that going to give us clues as to where the deficit might be? If they can tell faces apart, then that suggests that their FFA is fine. And if they can't, then that tells us there might be something going on in the FFA. So we took, well, originally, this has been tested for kind of a long time, and for a long time we were operating under the assumption that there was this same distinction. But there was a bit of historical argument in the field, and people said we weren't doing it right, and so we said, okay, we're going to do it better then. So we gave them a task, an identity perception task. So the task here is, it's like one of these things is not like the other, right? So you have to identify, is there an odd one out? So in the identity task, here, and the number of faces changes across trials, but they have to decide, is there an identity that's different? The answer to this one is yes. In case you're unsure, this person here on the bottom is different. Okay. We also, as a control task, gave them an emotion perception task. So same thing, but now all the faces have the same identity, but one emotion is different. So again, this one here is the thing that's not like the other. Here's the angry face among happy faces. And so I'll admit a little bit to my surprise, we actually found that of the 13 people with developmental prosopagnosia that we tested, 11 of them, they were accurate on this task, but they were very slow relative to the control subjects. It took them a lot longer to do the same thing, which, to be fair, was the argument that people were making. So they were right. But I always think that humility is a good thing in science. We were wrong, they were right. Yeah. So interestingly, on the emotion perception task, only 2 of 13 were impaired. So same general instructions. It can't be a result of the instructions, right? It's the task itself, the emotion piece, that was different. So they were able to do that relative to controls. And you might be wondering, well, maybe that task is just easier. So I'd just like to point out, because I'm not mentioning here, that there was a control group, and so we're measuring them relative to the controls. Okay. So to our question, do those with developmental prosopagnosia have deficits in face perception? We stand corrected. I think that generally speaking, yes. We can say yes to that. Are those with developmental prosopagnosia processing faces like they read words? That might seem like a really specific question, so I have to give you a little bit more history here. We already spoke about the fusiform face area and that visual word form area, right? And so the question here then becomes, are people with prosopagnosia essentially relying on that left hemisphere visual word form area to support their face recognition? And if so, we would expect their processing of faces to be kind of like their processing of text. Like they're processing it in the same way that they do when they read words in a book. So we develop a task where we have a fairly traditional face recognition task. They see full faces from different angles, and they have to identify those faces. And then we also process those faces through an algorithm that basically turned them into line drawings for us. So same faces, line drawings. And what we found was actually really fascinating. So first I just want to talk about the control group. So the gray lines here are the full content faces of above, and the black lines are the line drawing faces. So the control faces, not surprisingly, do much better at this than they do at this. Okay, that's what we expected. The developmental prosopagnosia group, statistically speaking, there was no difference between these two. Okay? But most importantly, the developmental prosopagnosia group did just as well on the line task as the controls did. So they didn't show any deficit here. So when we presented faces as line drawings, it was almost like their prosopagnosia went away. They could do that task without a problem. It was in the full face condition that we start to see this, that we see this clear deficit or distinction between the groups. So it sort of lends itself to the idea that they are maybe processing faces using that kind of more left-sided visual word form area, and what's going on in the right hemisphere, that fusiform face area, is what's struggling. Okay, so what aspects of face processing are impaired in developmental prosopagnosia, just to kind of sum up. So the strategy does appear to be normal in most of our subjects. They do seem to have deficits in face perception rather than just face memory, so it gives us clues as to what's going on there. And they also seem to be processing faces a little bit like line drawings. And there's other stuff that I could add to this too, but there's like a short summary for you. Okay, so I also want to leave you with a little bit of something that seems like not so, I don't know, negative information about all of the prosopagnosic subjects. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the training that we've done in the past, and this is work that we did at the University of British Columbia. But we didn't want to see it, could we improve face recognition in people with developmental prosopagnosia? So we gave them a task, and this was a super intensive study. We worked with each participant for a total of 10 months of time. They came in every few months, and they would spend literally days in the lab, like 3 days in a row, full days in a row, doing testing and all sorts of MRI and all sorts of things. But the crux of it, they got a training program that looked kind of like this, and the task, except it has a memory component to it, is they have to figure out which of these two faces is most like the top one. And as you can tell, they're real similar because they're morphed. But the program is adapted so that they're always training at their level. So if they get one wrong, the task gets easier, and if they get it right, the task gets harder. Okay. And then, importantly, over weeks of training, we start to introduce other things. So they start off with neutral faces, no emotion, and by the time they get to the end of the training program, they've got varied angle and varied emotion. So we're trying to introduce some of the things that you would experience in everyday life, the kind of variety in faces that you would see all the time. So what was really great about this, in this training program, is that if we train them on images that were identical to what they saw in the training program, right? So just all they had to do was remember those images. The training program, they had pretty decent improvements, which was great. And we had another group that was doing a control task, and they didn't show the same level of improvement. Okay. We also gave them faces that were at a new angle, like an angle that we didn't train them on. So we're trying to see, like, do those improvements generalize to new things? And they did improve very nicely with the new angle as well, but the control group didn't show that same improvement. And then we also trained them on we tested them on an expression that they never saw during training to make sure that it could generalize to that as well. And again, nice improvements that we don't see in the control group. So this is pretty exciting, and I would say probably the most exciting thing about this is that participants were also reporting to us changes that they were noticing in their everyday life. So I have a quote here. Participant said, "Recently I find myself recognizing a whole bunch of people on the street, way out of context, and the best part is that I'm recognizing them and initiating contact." So that was really exciting. So before I go into questions that you might have, I did want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to mentor undergraduate students. You might have noticed in my slide I had kind of shout outs to the students who had worked on some of these projects here at Bethel. There's also a lot of other students from UBC that contributed to this stuff. This is a picture of my second year as a graduate student. This actually popped up in my Facebook feed today, and I just quickly threw it in my talk. But the reason why this really stuck out to me is because it kind of caused me to reflect about, as a PhD student and as a postdoc, I had advisors that really felt passionate about the mentorship of undergrads and high school students as well. And I think most importantly, if I were to sum up the mentality that I received, it would be, if you treat an undergrad like a graduate student, they're going to act like one. And so this was my experience in graduate school. This is me here. We're tie-dyeing lab shirts in my front lawn, and those are the undergrads from the lab that are all participating in the activity. So anyways, there was kind of mentorship of undergrads from the very beginning. I was the only graduate student in the lab, and so I just really started to become passionate about mentoring undergrads through the research experience and taking that through. I would be totally mistaken to not give a shout out to the students that have worked with me here at Bethel contributing to these projects. There wasn't enough time to talk about all the projects that these students were involved in. But I wanted to at least give some visual recognition to them and talk a little bit, just very briefly, about I have a lot of improvement to make in advising undergraduate students. There's always improvements to make, but I do think that there's some things that I've learned in recent years that has made this process smooth and fairly successful, at least most of the time. So I just thought, I'm a big fan of crowdsourcing information, and so I thought I would share a few of these things. So one, I've really determined that it's super beneficial to have the students work in groups. As much as they might not always see the value of that from the beginning, I always tell students, look, usually research doesn't happen alone. It's not a solitary activity. You're working with collaborators. And so having the students working in groups is really nice, especially if they're taking research for variable credits. And the reason why that's nice is because there might be one student who's doing research for 3 credits and another who's doing it for 1. And basically, we put these students together, and it becomes really easy for them to determine who's going to do what, because one is taking it for 3 credits and one is taking it for 1. And so the divide becomes clear based on the credits. There's the variable credit thing. I also have students develop sort of a contract with one another and decide how they want to contribute. And so in this way, I think of it as kind of backwards designing the research experience. So I like to sit down with the student and say, what experiences do you want to gain? And how can we translate that into what we're going to do? Sometimes students are like, I want practice in coming up with my own idea. And they do, and that's great. And I support them through that process. And sometimes that means I'm advising something that I know very little about. And we can always pull in a collaborator in that case. And sometimes they're like, I want to work on the stuff that you're doing, but I really want a chance to do data analysis in R, in which case then we make that happen. I also have come to have a really clear research syllabus where students basically go through and they make a plan for the semester of what they're going to be doing and when. And we have regular check-ins so they have a sense of how they're doing with that. In that sense, I'm having the students determine the timeline. And then lastly, I've realized the value of collaborating with people outside of Bethel as part of this and making the students involved in that process. Because then they're getting connections with people outside of Bethel, and we also have more research opportunities when we're able to collaborate outside. So pulling them into the collaboration with UBC and things like that. So with that, I'll stop. So thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
We with the line drawing finding
Yeah.
and the hypothesis about maybe they're using the readings, do you notice that their eyes track from left to right in the same manner that we read from their faces?
They do. Yeah, because we have that from, the reading task that we do with the eye tracker.
Excellent stuff. Line drawing again.
Yeah.
So if we reverse hypothesis, both control group and them have the same accomplishment in the line drawing part, but then as development happens, control group could identify depth more. So is that something that happens in depth perception and truly that's affecting those with the facial blindness?
It could
Because
be.
the baseline is the same, the advancement is what's differing.
Yeah, it could be a depth perception thing. I'll admit that we haven't directly tested depth perception. We do a lot of extensive vision testing with our prosopagnosic subjects, but depth, I'll admit, is not one of them. That said, usually when somebody complains of a problem with depth perception, they'll also report like running into things and stuff like that. So I would be surprised if they had a problem with depth perception, but it could be something subtle.
But I'm thinking that if you're training them with pictures, starting them with line drawing is the same, but as they start looking at two-dimensional and more stuff on the pictures, maybe could that be a better training strategy?
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways that people have approached the training like problem, and that would be an interesting way to do it. So like start with the line drawing and then have progressively pictures that are less and less line drawing light and see how that makes a difference. Yeah, potentially.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but that one follows.
Okay.
So, have you done fMRI,
Mm-hmm.
looking at in developmental prosopagnosia, that the fusiform area is activated when reading? Like maybe it's to take both sides of the hemisphere are doing like the reading instead of one developing into like a facial recognition more so.
Yeah. We have fMRI data for our subjects from UBC, and we have the reading data. We haven't done with those subjects. No, we did, actually. This is one example of the very, very deep depths to which our data go.
Yeah.
We actually did do a reading task in the scanner, I'm remembering now. So we have the data, but we haven't looked at that question.
I think that'd be super interesting.
Yeah, it would be interesting. There's people who have done studies, not me, who have taken non-prosopagnosic subjects and tried to look at, like, for example, how activation, the FFA and the VWFA develops over time. And so I think we're pretty clear on that now, that like they both kind of activate towards faces, and then at some point there's kind of like the right becomes face dominant, the left becomes text dominant.
Right.
But without a doubt, the VWFA, the left side, still shows activation to faces. So it's not like it completely goes away. And so, an interesting question is like, what are these two areas doing? Like, let's stop thinking about them as face areas and word areas and think about like, what's the underlying thing that they're contributing to the processing of faces and words, which is where I think that research becomes really interesting. Especially also the sorting of the handwriting styles.
Right. So it's not like the same difference thing. Like, can you recognize similarity versus differences? But it's clearly more complex than that. But there's something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a whole like world of research that's exploding about this. Yeah. You got a question?
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. Are you still like conducting research?
All the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm interested.
Katie.
So with this treatment that you've discovered and implemented that has shown real difference in people's lives, do you think that could eventually become like an experimental treatment that people could opt into? Or like, do you see that happening soon, or is this way too deep? We need to look into it more.
I think it could. I wouldn't call the training a cure. There were some people like the quote that I and I know you didn't, but there's some people like that quote. She was like, "This has made a big difference in my life." There's other people who were like showed nice improvements, and they were like, "In my life, maybe a little bit here and there." They had a few anecdotes, but they didn't feel like it was like life transformative. And it's not the case that every single person improved. And so the training realm, I mean, I think in the best case scenario, yes, we would like keep working on the training thing, and then we'd make it publicly available so everybody could do it. It's a time and a resource problem. They're really expensive studies and they take forever. So that's the biggest roadblock to making what you're saying happen. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering if you run into, it seems like what you're studying could inform or could be informed by facial recognition software. Have you run into that, or I'm just curious if you've seen that connection or what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, the short answer to your question is yes, that should happen. In my experience, there's not enough conversation happening between, there's like tons of research on like how can we get computers to recognize faces. Obviously there's like been a lot of like very recent success in that domain. Like, I mean, you know that if you use Facebook or pretty much anything that like wants to automatically tag your pictures. But there's that, and then there's the world of prosopagnosia research, and there needs to be more crosstalk. Right now, in my experience, there's not a ton of that crosstalk happening. So I should do that. I'll add to my list. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions?
So I'm just curious, since I've had some recent conversations with people who are dealing with parents who have Alzheimer's. And there's a point, or dementia, and there's a point when they're no longer being recognized. The person with the diagnosis is no longer recognizing the people that, that's a stranger, that's not my wife, that's a stranger. Are we talking about the same?
I mean, we wouldn't call it prosopagnosia. The other thing that's hard to like pull apart a little bit is that when you have somebody that comes in and they're like, I don't know who people are, you have to spend a great deal of time like being a detective for a while. Is it that you don't know people's names? Is it that you can't remember information about them? Is it that you can't tell faces apart? Is it that you can't remember the faces later? Is your general memory affected? Is there something wrong with your vision? And so we have to kind of spend a lot of time ruling all of these things out. And I would suspect that a lot of those things are all contributing to failure to recognize people in cases of Alzheimer's because there's more like widespread atrophy that's happening. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for coming.